Hi, I'm Brian Cranston, and you're listening to the Pantheon Network.
Hey there, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 7, Episode 12 of Music is Not a Genre. Let's do the hand gestures, MxG. Thank you as always for watching and listening. Listeners, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre to get a video for every episode of this podcast. Watchers, go to nickdimatteo.com/musicisnotagenre, and you can just listen and not have to see this wonderful get-up I have right here for this episode. And of course, everyone go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre to support this podcast and my band Rec and everything I do. Sponsor, as always, is Qobuz. Qobuz is a music streaming service. Costs about the same as Spotify or Apple, but it has high-res audio files and a lot of other features. And please don't forget to like, share, subscribe, follow, comment, etc., rate, review, whatever it is they ask you to do. I don't really know. I'm not really good at that. Anyway, this week's episode is all about what kind of country music do I even like? That's been the question my whole life. Now, those of you who have been fans of this show know that I'm not a very big fan of country music. There's some country music that I'm into, but not a whole lot of it, I have to say. But in the spirit of MxG, music is not a genre, and I know that country music has played a seminal part in the music world in general, and it deserves a mention, and not just a mention, it deserves a full episode dedicated to it. I'm well aware of that. I often overstate my dislikes for effect, and that's just the truth. And that's because, well, you know, this is an entertainment show as well as an education show, so I like to say things like, there's no such thing as this, and this is the greatest this, and etc. And in this case, that's sort of true. Actually, what I say about country music is honestly rarely overstatement for me, and I'll get to the particulars of this later on. Then again, that said, there are and have always been country artists and country songs that I do like and did once like, let's say. So the format of this episode, and by the way, those of you who are wondering where I'm from, you're just going to have to guess. And then you listeners out there who are wondering what in the hell's going on, go ahead over to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre and check out my outfit. It's about as close as I can get to authentic country, although there are many authentic countries. Let's be honest about that. Show format, going to go through the prehistory country music, the origins, and then decade by decade, the development of country music in this country, in the U.S. of A., highlighting certain artists and songs and movements within the genre, changes, subgenres. I'm going to go through conclusions, including why I generally don't like the genre, what I do like about the genre, and what makes the best country music and music in general. Featured song, questions, and of course, always the bonus MxTRA video at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre. And this week's bonus MxTRA video is the longest running country music artist in history. Anybody out there having a guess as who's the longest running country music artist in history? Longest consistently running country music artist. I won't say which one it is, other than I will be mentioning this artist once or twice in this episode. So if you hear the name and you want to shout out a guess, I won't hear you because this is not live. Sources are Wikipedia, Library of Congress, PBS.org, the Ken Burns country music documentary. Has some great information on there. Victrola.com, Britannica.com, GrammyMusic.org, HNOC.org, the Historic New Orleans Collection Museum, and Tennessean.com. Disclaimers, I will, of course, be biased, though I'll do my best to cover parts of everything, and that's just about all I can say about disclaiming. So let's get right into it then. Origins. Though the recording and documenting of country music dates back to the 1920s, recording industry in general. It dates back a little farther than that, but the 1920s is when they really started to record country music. The origins go back much further. There are some strains of music that predate what we know of as country music, country western music, those kinds of things that I'm going to talk about right now. One is the European ballad tradition. Story songs, often dating back to the 1700s, propagated in this country, especially in the 1800s. Think Barbara Allen, a song that is almost 400 years old, as far as we know. Many of those 1800s folk songs from, by the way, folk songs comes from the 1846 term folklore, which was coined by somebody, traditions of commoners, essentially. Many of those 1800s folk songs were lyrics written on the backs of old melodies, so the melodies may be much older than that, and adapted for the community's current situation. For example, bury me not on the lone prairie, bury me not on the lone prairie, was adapted from an old sailor song. Ain't no prairies in the Atlantic Ocean. Main idea is that these songs were mostly passed down as oral tradition by common folk, such as us, distinct from chamber music commissioned by the wealthy or the church. Or the wealthy church. I've often made the case that all modern popular music is folk music. My father has always said that, and I believe it to be true. Non-chamber music, non-classical music, etc. Even quite a bit of jazz itself can be considered folk music, although it's much more intricate than the average folk song. These songs tell, the ballads tell of the plight of life, hardship, love won or lost, or never found, death, illness, struggles of other kinds, sometimes with humor, sometimes darker and sadder, more melancholy. Though these songs came primarily from English, Scots, and Irish settlers, some were from other countries, but really that's the main thing. I mean, we are primarily an English-speaking country. Indigenous music was also in the mix, as well as music from neighboring Mexico and Canada. And the African slave music traditions were a huge contributor. Again, this is all prehistory. All of this as early as the 1600s. Yes, even that. Most of this musical development happened in the south and southwest of the country. So that's why it's associated with those parts of the country. The main component of country music is its rhythm, often meant to be danced to or bopped along with. A steady and consistent rhythm tends to be the case with most country songs. This comes from, in one sense, high-energy fiddle and banjo tunes. Another contributor to country music pre its existence. So stringed instruments. Fiddle, European, of course. Banjo, from Africa, arrived as a gourd with a fretless neck and became a huge part not only of country music, folk music, such like Appalachian music, things like that. But next week's episode, when I talk about Philadelphia and New Orleans and how the banjos played a huge part in a certain thing having to do with Philadelphia music, which again, that'll be next week's podcast. Common life struggles are often intertwined with the promise and hope of something better in these songs. Not always, but sometimes, most of the time, let's be honest. So church music became an integral part of this development. Primarily, both the black and white Baptist traditions is where the music was most influenced by. Early forms of country and folk music that congealed were Appalachian, as I mentioned before, and Cajun, as well as Western cowboy life traditions that were often influenced by Native American and Tejano traditions. Country music is itself an ever-changing amalgam, cannot be reduced to just one, oh, this is country. And though it's often been characterized as white music, that's only half the story, as always, as we're seeing now more than at any time in the last 100 years. And I have said all music is black music, meaning all music from the last, 150 years at least. By as early as the mid-1860s, professional songwriters like Stephen Foster were making money from sheet music and performances, writing new folk songs. The first step toward the commercialization of country music. These songs were often performed in traveling minstrel shows and medicine shows, and at the same time, At that same time, the blues was emerging from slave and post-slave traditions, often using the same parallel influences as white folk music, but bringing, of course, their own traditions. By the end of that century and into the early 20th century, though all of these styles existed and were mixing and crossing back and forth, commodifiers, a.k.a. people wanting to make more money off of this music, divided all of it into two main categories: hillbilly music, meaning white country music, and race music, meaning blues and black country music. So, racist, but that's what was happening at the time. Hillbilly music was coined by pianist Al Hopkins in 1925. Despite the budding recording industry trying to market these styles, they continue to cross back and forth, both for the music creators and the fans. And of course, the origins of rock and roll. In fact, many of the earliest hillbilly recording artists worked with black session musicians, including Arnold Schultz and Leslie Riddle. And black harmonica player DeFord Bailey was one of the founders of the Grand Ole Opry, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So that's kind of a prehistory of where a lot of the influence of country music came from, how it came to be developed into that before it even had a name, and certainly before it had the name country music. As I mentioned, we're getting in now to the 1920s, the earliest phase of recorded country music and commercial country music, let's say. And back then, what we know of most traditionally as country music was called hillbilly music. During this era, record companies and radio stations popularized early country music or hillbilly music through barn dance radio shows. They were started in the middle of the decade and led very quickly to the Grand Ole Opry, which started under another name, I think a barn dance name, in 1925, and then named Grand Ole Opry by 1927. That's how long it's been around. It was starting to be recorded just over 100 years ago. Hillbilly music encompassed bluegrass, southern country and folk, western, gospel, Appalachian, among other folk traditions, but decidedly did not include black music, blues, anything that was influenced or created or performed by black artists, at least in name. I'll get to what I mean by that later. That would have been under the race music category. As usual, with pretty much all the music I discuss, the only reason we think of it as a distinct genre is because business people classified it as such to target market it. And the more we dig into it, the more we see how disparate it is. One of the distinct elements of this music is that differentiated from other professionally marketed and sold music from the beginning is that it was most often written by the performers themselves. That's not the case with a lot of things. Even prior to that, you had somebody like, let's say, Schubert Franz Schubert doing a song, and then of course someone else would sing it. Although Schubert might have been on the piano, let's say. But Stephen Foster, I believe, did perform, but was mostly just the writer and would write for other performers, etc., which, of course, was the tradition prior to the advent of hillbilly music, country music. And also during that period, and you had people as early as Rudy Valley and people like that singing other people's songs. But in most cases, these were songs written by the performers, and that's something that wouldn't come to prominence in the main culture until with other types of music. And besides, of course, the parallel blues music, until people like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly, and of course the Beatles and beyond made artists who sang other people's music seem old hat. But this is something that was happening from the get-go with country music. It was most often played by groups like the Skillet Lickers and the Carter Family. Carter Family is a huge one. But also by soloists like Jimmy Rogers and fiddling John Carson. And these are the 1920s artists, 30s artists, beyond a little bit, but starting in the 20s. As I've said before in many episodes, most musicians have always cared way less about keeping music segregated. Musicians pull from wherever, and other musicians are happy about it. And though crossovers have often been characterized as co-opting or cultural appropriation, most music created this way was initially done out of love and respect, and then usually, not always, but usually corrupted by the industry. Some small portion of musicians themselves were exploitative and wouldn't give credit where credit was due, but mostly it was the business people. And I say this because even as early as the 1920s, white performers were recording blues music as country music. The kind of crossover that, again, would eventually create rock and roll and many other forms of music down the line, including what's happening right now. Which brings us to the 1930s and 40s. Western music was being recorded in the 1920s, but really took over in the 1930s. Often known as singing cowboy music at the time. Think Gene Autry, who could be considered maybe the first country music superstar, although he started out as an imitator of Jimmy Rogers. So we know Jimmy Rogers came before. And don't forget Roy Rogers, name spelled differently, by the way. One has a D, one doesn't. These are people who were taking country music to slicker, more polished places, palatable for a wider audience, let's say, whether you agree with that or not, and real precursors of pop country. Now, things that helped that along with radio, and the barn dance shows and all that, and the Grand Ole Opry, and greater access to 78 RPM recordings where people could now really afford themselves, Victrolas and such. That played a big part, but also the advent of talkies, motion pictures with sound, where the singing cowboy trend really took off in the 1930s and certainly beyond. As with blues often being absorbed into country, starting in the previous decade in the 20s and never stopping, it's constant crossover, artists began mixing in jazz elements in the 1930s, creating Western swing as a subgenre. Bob Wills was well known for this. Bob Wills, and was also one of the first to add electric guitar and drums to country music in the late 1930s. Prior to that, drums were considered too brash for the prevailing folksy styles, and electric guitar was really kind of only in jazz. Honky-tonk and boogie-woogie were also widely incorporated by the latter part of the 1930s and really shaped country music of the 1940s. Hank Williams was the big honky-tonk guy in the 1940s, surely. And now we have Junior, and now we have the third. Kind of like the Carter family. It was also in the 1940s when Bill Monroe started developing a harder driving picking sound from earlier string band music, banjo especially, that became known as bluegrass after the name of his band, Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys. Earl Scruggs gets credit for that style of banjo playing, that is for sure. This decade is also when things started to gel in Nashville. Prior to this, it was Atlanta and believe it or not, in my hometown, New York City, that were the major recording and business centers for country music, and New York City, of course, much other kinds of music. Probably not coincidentally, when hillbilly music was replaced by the term country music is right around when things started to gel in Nashville. And eventually that became country and western music, and then one just went back to country music. And that would stay that way for decades and would encompass quite a few different styles for a while until divisions and subdivisions and things like that. Certain characteristics we now associate with country were by this point fairly solidified. Nashville helped solidify it even more. Twangy vocals, like you hear me talking this week. Relatively simple chord progressions, not always, but usually relatively simple. Simple beats, something you can dance to. Storytelling lyrics, absolutely. One of the big facets of most country music. There have always been exceptions to all of that. I don't know what story Ache to Break Your Heart tells. So things like that, the line dancing kind of songs that were more for fun. But generally, those are the characteristics of country music. So that brings us to the 1950s and 60s. And by the 1950s, country music was selling very well. It was one of the big sellers and influencing tons of artists. That's just a fact. This is really a pivotal year or era in that what we think of as country music became much more coded and would stay that way for quite a while. I would say if we're talking about pivotal decades, 1920s, starting of recording, yes, a lot of things developed in the 30s and 40s that would influence. But when the 1950s hit and Nashville was already established, the way things gelled and solidified in that decade influenced country music for decades to come. So I would say the 20s and the 50s, and then you'll see what other decades I consider pivotal in the general genre of country. And this is because further branching into things like rockabilly and eventually rock and roll ended up distinguishing country music as having a more traditional and less aggressive sound. So, though I will say this, though all of them now considered the guitar and often the electric guitar to be the prominent mode of country music. So you're talking blues to some degree, although that was often acoustic, but certainly rockabilly and rock and roll, electric guitar was a big part of it, and that is the country music influence for sure. And again, these styles were created by musicians of every color, not staying in their lanes, cross-braiding. That's how the best music is made. It's also because Nashville became such a powerhouse that it dominated the recording of the music and really more or less dictated the style and arrangements, homogenizing traditional country into something even slicker than that of Gene Autry and Roy Rogers. And that was in part to distinguish it. Oh, rockabilly, they had to call it something else because it was too aggressive for country, let's say. And then, of course, rock and roll, offshoot of that went far enough afield that there wasn't going to be country no more, though you always get country influence in rock and roll. That country music industry doubled down on, well, this is country, this is not this is not rock, this is not rockabilly. So by the 1950s, also Tejano and other Mexican-American traditions were becoming a much heavier influence. And you would see that strain through country music for many, many decades, including straight up to today. All of this music was more diverse and livelier than traditional country music, rockabilly, Tejano. And though today we'd be more likely to characterize rockabilly as closer to country than rock, at the time that was not the case, since rockabilly was one of the early names for rock and roll. Sam Phillips of Sun Records would say about it, it's not black, it's not white, it's not pop, it's not country. It's an amalgam. Check out my Amalgam Effect episode from a couple weeks ago. You know I love them. Some breakout stars that straddled this rock-country divide, and there would be many stars throughout the decades that would straddle the country divide with some other thing. But starting here, when things were not quite as distinguished one from the other, Elvis, Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly, Everly Brothers, Wanda Jackson. Wait, what did I just say? I just said Wanda Jackson. Why does that matter? Well, because it's notable that I haven't mentioned yet a single female artist. And the only black artists I mentioned were artists who worked for other white country music artists, because this is about country. It's not about the blues and jazz and all that. The former, of course, or actually the latter, of course, because the industry was still heavily segregating music and labels used for it. Hillbilly race music, whatever else it was called in the 50s, despite many non-white performers doing country music since forever, often, again, uncredited. And the latter, the former, I have these mixed up. The former's first, and that was about women, and that's simple sexism. Female country music artists were around since forever, and I mean since before country was country. And though none had hits prior to the 1950s, they were seminal parts of many of the successful bands. Think Carter Family's Sarah and Maybelle Carter. That changed in 1952 when Kitty Wells scored a hit with It Wasn't God Who Made Honky Tonk Angels. She opened the door and was soon followed by Patsy Cline, Tammy Wynette, Loretta Lynn, and many others, proving yet again that if you can convince the powers that be that something can make money, they'll get on board. Climate change, supporting the less fortunate, education, anyone. I really do think, this is one of my pet philosophies, that we need to sell ideas better and make them somehow profitable to somebody. And that's when the powers that be and the businesses who are hoarding all the money will put their money behind those ideas. So Kitty Wells showed them women can make money in country music and be popular. Okay, let's do more of that now. That's how the business has always worked. Black country artists, now, they didn't really break through until the 1960s with people like Charlie Pride. The crossover album of Ray Charles was huge, and Linda Martell, who's a pioneer, really. So back to our story. As rockabilly morphed into rock and roll in the 1960s, came country found ways to distance itself even more from all of that. On the slicker side was pop country or countrypolitan, country pop. A very Nashville, slowly rising to dominance over the next couple of decades. Many of the female artists I mentioned, as well as Charlie Pride and Glenn Campbell, late great Glenn Campbell, were great examples of this. Also, on the rougher side was the Bakersfield sound. That's California. Basically taking rock and roll elements and quickly repurposing them for straight up country. Think Buck Owens and Merle Haggard, that kind of more aggressive sound. So you had that slick sound and the dirtier sound. These two strains would exemplify many of the developments of country music in the next decade and beyond. Which brings us to the next decade, 1970s. That's where I checked in for country music. I know some country music from before Stand By Your Man and all that. I think that was before the 70s. I honestly don't know. I guess I don't know. But I mainly started to tune into what country music was in the 1970s. By the 1960s, 70s, rock music had distanced itself from country so much that it was starting to turn back. Think John Wesley Harding, Dylan's 1967 album, or Buffalo Springfield, or The Byrds, or anything by Graham Parsons. There were certain songs by the Beatles, Stones, The Who, and the Kinks that were very country-leaning. So rock and roll was referring back to a genre that now seemed, older than it was. At the same time, country was fairly well divided, as at the end of the 1960s into slick and rough in the 1970s. So 1970s country was characterized by three main strains, let's say. Pop country, countrypolitan, outlaw country from the kind of rougher Bakersfield sound, and country rock or southern rock. So some pop country examples in the 70s, Bobby Gentry, John Denver, one of my favorites, Olivia Newton-John early on, Anne Murray, B.J. Thomas, some of what Linda Ronstadt did. I was a pretty big fan of John Denver, a passing fan, a song or two of Anne Murray and Linda Ronstadt. And, of course, we can't forget Dolly Parton, Kenny Rogers, big one, too, of pop country. Crystal Gayle, Ronnie Millsap, Barbara Mandrell, strong contenders. A lot of the crossover country bands had soft rock and or yacht rock hits. Think Pure Prairie League, which, by the way, featured Vince Gill eventually on vocals, especially during their heyday. And a lot of that was just kind of like soft rock. And so much soft rock was country influenced, like the bands Bread or America. Can't get wider than those two things, or wider than bread, let's say. Outlaw country was the second strain in the 70s. You had Johnny Cash, Merle Haggard, Willie Nelson, the not late great Willie Nelson, Hank Williams Jr. now, Waylon Jennings, Joe Ely, and the late great Chris Christopherson just recently died. Somebody I always admire because he was a polymath. Look it up. A subgenre of this rougher was trucker country. I distinctly remember so many songs about trucking and CB radio, including C.W. McCall's Convoy from 1976, and of course TV shows like Dukes of Hazzard, BJ and the Bear, and movies like Smokey and the Bandit. The country was a big industry in the 70s, that kind of rougher country. And then, of course, the third strain was the country rock. I was actually a big fan of, I'll say, southern rock about 15 or so years after it was a big thing. But some 70s bands that were southern rock, country rock, the band, Allman Brothers, Alabama, Charlie Daniels, Bob Seger, Eagles, Marshall Tucker, Creedence to a degree, Janis Joplin a little bit, Lynyrd Skynyrd, of course, and Little Feat. And yes, many of these, by some people, are often considered more rock than country. But that's kind of the point of both the subgenre of country rock, southern rock, and this podcast. Music is not a genre. You decide what you want to label. It doesn't really matter. What all of this resulted in was a super surge of crossover pop and rock hits. And all of these can continue to develop, dominate, subdivide, and reconverge in the subsequent decades. And you will see what I mean by that after this mid-roll break. Thanks for hanging with me so far. I'll talk to you in just about a minute. Hey, thanks for checking out this episode of Music is Not a Genre. If you'd like to learn more about this podcast, if you'd like to learn more about the music I do with my band Rec or any other projects or anything else about me, go to nickdematteo.com. That's Nick, DEMATTEO.com. And everything is there. There's even a link to a merch store where you can get t-shirts and mugs and hats and totes and notebooks and so many other things. I'm always adding new products there. Great way to support the podcast. And finally, go to patreon.com/music is not a genre if you'd really like to show your support. My fans and lovely family there get exclusives and other perks and early releases, and they get to suggest topics for future podcasts as well. Thanks for listening to the mid-roll. Now back to the show. Well, hey, we're back. Thank you for checking out that mid-roll and that asshole northerner who did that commercial. Listen, we all got to get along. It's just that's the only way we're going to move forward. Anywhere, in this country especially. Speaking of moving forward, let's move forward to the 1980s. And in a way, as far as at least what we think of as country, that's kind of where I checked out. So my window of being somewhat into country music of some kinds kind of was very short. I don't know, you call short, 10, 15 years, maybe say. There were traces of country in popular culture throughout the 1980s, though it was stronger in the beginning than the end in the pop culture. The converging of styles and fan groups started to diverge again as the 80s took shape. So the early 80s saw some of the biggest pop country hits as really a holdover from the 1970s from artists like Juice Newton, Queen of Hearts, Angel of the Morning, Oak Ridge Boys, Elvira, which was a cover of a 1966 country song by Dallas Frazier, which I didn't know, and that was one of my favorite songs at the time was Elvira. I used to sing it with my dad. Dolly Parton's 9 to 5, Eddie Rabbitt's I Love a Rainy Night, all 1981. All of those were 1981. Kenny Rogers' Lady from 1980, but of course was also popular in 1981. Big year for country music. Willie Nelson's Always on My Mind from 1982. And To All the Girls I've Loved Before with Julio Iglesias in 1984. Huge. All of these are huge country hits. Islands in the Stream, written by the Bee Gees, or Barry Gibb at least. Was that Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton? Was it? Huge. And you know how I feel about the Bee Gees. Another huge country hit, though. I partly like all of these songs that I named because my dad performed, I think, all of them. And again, I sang Elvira with him. This surge was accompanied by another subgenre called neo country. If you think of John Travolta's Urban Cowboy and all the offshoots of that, and how that line dancing became, I won't say that was the first craze for line dancing because I don't know enough about the country culture in general, but it was the first time as a pop culture phenomenon that line dancing came into consciousness for a lot of people. These were kind of a disco-y dance influenced strain of country. Think of the song 9 to 5 even. That's kind of disco-y if you never thought of it that way. And that would spur, pun intended, the line dancing craze, like I've said. I also remember huge interest at the time in having cowboy hats and all of course, the fashion and all that. I mean, this denim jacket that I'm wearing here is actually from the 1980s. And even though it's a little bit later than this era I'm talking about now, 5-6 years later, one of the reasons why denim came back so strongly was because of this. Just one of the reasons. But also mechanical bulls. There were country-themed bars that right in the middle of the damn thing would have these mechanical bulls, and people would just go and ride them. Now, I know they still exist, but they were everywhere, even in New Jersey at the time. So some of the outlaw style also hung on in the 80s with people like Dwight Yoakam and Steve Earle, Roseanne Cash. They would continue, of course. There was a new similar kind of rough kind of country, younger strain called cowpunk, which really was early alt country. And we'll get to that a little bit in the next decade. It fused country with punk, post-punk, new wave. If you think Violent Femmes, when I did my episode on the Femmes, and they're one of my favorite bands, I talked about how they were alt country before alt country was alt country. Social Distortion, Mojo Nixon, who's mentioned by the Dead Milkmen, who were in some ways cowpunk, I guess you call it country punk. Meat Puppets And, of course, Dead Milkmen from Philadelphia. That's why I know a little bit more about that. And the Mekons. By the mid to late 1980s, this pop surge died down considerably as country itself started to grow, due mostly to the neo-traditionalist movement. So you had this kind of, if you look at a graph and you say, well, in the 1970s and early 80s, pop country was rising, and then it started to fall. And as it started to fall, country music itself in its own culture started to rise, which would influence the next decade. And at the same time, non-country or country crossover artists in the mid to late 80s had a lot of hits like Billy Vera and the Beaters, Bruce Hornsby, Bonnie Raitt, Chris Isaak, John Mellencamp, and Springsteen. They were all doing heavily country-influenced music, sometimes straight-up country. Not surprisingly, the spread of country music to include other genres like pop, dance and electronic, rock, blues, yet again, punk and post-punk and new wave, caused a retro backlash among more traditional country fans and musicians. This divide continues. This resulted in the minting of some of the hugest country stars. And most of them would not cross over into pop, at least not right away, but wouldn't need to because they were plenty successful in the country world on their own. Just a few examples. And you'll say to me when you hear this, well, yeah, they crossed over, but I'm talking about the 80s, before a lot of that crossover happened. Travis Tritt, Reba McEntire, Alison Krauss, George Strait, Alan Jackson, Kathy Mattea, Randy Travis, Dwight Yoakam, Clint Black, Ricky Skaggs, the Judds, Lyle Lovett, let's even say. And this set the stage for country to return to the forefront in the next decade. So before I get to this decade, that'd be the 1990s, of course, one of my favorites. I want to set the stage for you. So again, just to review, country was rising into the early mid 80s, and then I'm talking in the pop world, and then it started to fall for a few years as it developed other things. And those country artists, in a way, got wise, but maybe some might say that the country itself got wise and started to rediscover what was good about this music, if that's kind of music you liked, which I did not at the time, but I'm giving it credit. So the 1990s, country continued to fracture and subdivide and then reconverge in many ways. In many ways, the 1990s were as pivotal to country as the 1950s. So that's the third pivotal decade I'm talking about, was the 1990s. Because you could say, of course, 60s, good country hits that were offshoots of what was happening in the 50s. The 70s had its developments, which would play big parts in decades to come, but it was disparate. The 80s, there were some hits, but it didn't last the whole decade. And then the 90s come absolutely pivotal, another pivotal, because by 1990, by the beginning of the decade, country music was huge again. The most prominent strains were still derived from the big three of the previous era: slick, rough, and rock. Right. Despite the surge of country hits in the pop charts in the late 70s and early 80s, as I mentioned, that didn't come close to what happened in the 1990s. And in a way, the 90s defined the country landscape until just very recently. Really defined the country landscape. Well, let's see, 90, so 2000, 2010, so almost 30 years, let's say, 25 years. Same with female artists making more of an impact in the 70s and 80s, sure. Didn't come close to the success of female country artists in the 1990s and furthermore beyond. Though others might spend some time classifying these artists into one or more of those categories up that I mentioned above, the rough and slick and rock, they switched it up enough to have elements of all of them, so things were kind of reconverging. You had, the hugies, especially the first one, Garth Brooks, Billy Ray Cyrus, right there. They revolutionized how high country could go in the pop world. Billy Ray helped to reinstitute line dancing as a craze. So what kind of came and went in the 80s, and I've never been a fan of group dances in general, electric slide and chicken and all that stuff. It's not my thing, whether it's at a wedding or somewhere else. So when line dancing came and went, I was happy to see it go. And then when it came back in the 90s, I was like, oh, that's my comeuppance, because it never went away. Still here. Vince Gill, Clint Black, John Michael Montgomery, Tim McGraw, son of Tug McGraw, Phillies pitcher. Said it before. Kenny Chesney, Keith Urban, Brooks and Dunn, George Strait, again, Toby Keith. Many holdovers from the 1980s. They were all super successful starting in the 1990s. And that's just the man. Let's talk about K.D. Lang and Faith Hill and Martina McBride and Deanna Carter and Leanne Rhymes and Leanne Womack and maybe some other Leanne I don't know. Mindy McCready, Pam Tillis, Laura Morgan, Shania Twain, and Mary Chapin Carpenter, among many others, and eventually including the Chicks, formerly the Dixie Chicks. Female country artists just blew up in the way that female rock artists were blowing up and all of that. And again, pale shadow of what would happen in the ensuing decades. Along with these popular stars, more or less using all of the big three elements, slick and rough and rock, came a further development of cowpunk called alt country. One that would broaden from being just kind of agitated, like based on the punk and the driving, into kind of lusher and weirder corners, which would what made it alt and not cowpunk. Lucinda Williams and Lyle Lovett were precursors of this, as were all those cowpunk bands I mentioned. Then you had bands in the 90s who were alt country like Uncle Tupelo and subsequently Wilco and Son Volt, Drive-By Truckers, Old 97s, Nickel Creek, Nico Case, Whiskey Town and Ryan Adams, Old Crow Medicine Show, Hank Williams III, so that's three of them we mentioned, String Cheese Incident. I'd even put, in hindsight, Hootie and the Blowfish into that kind of alt country, although they were more pop country or country rock. I don't know. They were Hootie. These are critically acclaimed but commercially not super successful artists, with the exception of Hootie, who shouldn't be in that list, because very few radio stations or stores knew where to put them. Alt country couldn't be classified easily. It's notable at the end of the 1990s, I started to see a striking similarity in the songcraft, subjects, etc. between pop country and pop R&B. Using kind of the same tropes, defaulting to the same subjects, both just as cloistered in their approaches to production and style. And I say that because I remember having this thought in like 1999. So, was that 25 years, 26 years before today, when that's a huge thing now, is that they have merged. But let's go to 2000. So I'm going to say, and I said, that 2000 to 2014 was kind of its own era. And you'll see why when I get there. Things were largely the same throughout that era. By this time, country had pretty much settled into either pop or alt. And both were using elements from all facets of country history. Just mining country. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou thrust traditional country back into public consciousness again and influenced alt country as well. Its presence in the pop charts would continue, and many non-country artists would begin to cross over into the country world. Think Bon Jovi, Kid Rock, Richard Marx, Sheryl Crow, Darius Rucker from Hootie, Mr. Hootie. I think his name is Darius Rucker Hootie. Pop country has continued to grow essentially since the 1990s, but really since the mid to late 2000s, when it was just gigantic. When you think Carrie Underwood, Miley Cyrus, early stuff, Kelly Clarkson, Casey Musgraves, Miranda Lambert, Mary Mars, Taylor Swift, eventually, women were never more dominant until, of course, after that than they were. Then you had Brad Paisley and Blake Shelton and Trace Atkins and Dierks Bentley and Jason Aldean and Luke Bryan and Luke Combs and 7 other Lukes and Eric Church and Jason Isbell. And then the Chicks were still there, and the band Perry and Zach Brown Band and Big and Rich. Although I think Rich was big. Is Rich big? I don't know. I don't know that band very well. Lady A, formerly Antebellum, Rascal Flatts, Sugarland, Alabama Shakes, Florida Georgia Line. So many of the artists who started big in the 90s also continued their success in the 2000s through 2014. But then you had alt country like Bright Eyes and My Morning Jacket and Kings of Leon and Fleet Foxes and Chris Stapleton and the Civil Wars and Sturgill Simpson and Margot Price. And many of these have dabbled in pop or more traditional country, pop country, more traditional country. And throughout that period, when you had some of those bands, that was sort of again, I'm thinking it's kind of all the same strains. It's the slick, it's the rough, it's the rock, and it's the alt. And that's what was happening in the 2000. When you get to 2015 and to the present, this is a point at which black country artists started to make more inroads in a big way. Again, they've existed since forever, since before country music was country music. But by this period, there was a trickle of more black artists in country music that, of course, would develop into what's happening today. So you had Kane Brown, Jelly Roll, who transitioned away from hip-hop to more country-ish, Brittany Howard with Alabama Shakes, eventually solo, Lil Nas X in 2019, I think it was. Jeez. Opened the door even more for so many other black artists, old and new. And those artists really started to change the face and the quote-unquote face of country. So in other words, change the face, of course, because diversifying, but change that quote-unquote face, meaning what was considered country music. The sound would broaden. Funkier, hip-hoppier, more R&B elements. I won't say blues because I will say blues because every single decade, the blues has been influencing every kind of music. Shaboozey is a big one, of course. Breland, The War and Treaty, Yola, Willie Jones, Mickey Guyton, Brittany Spencer, Rhiannon Giddens, Blanco Brown, so many others. Now, tell me what other decade can you mention that many black country music artists, one after another, who are all very successful? You can't. They might have existed, but you can't. Artists from other genres, again, are starting to cross over. Recently, think of Beyonce, Incredible, and Post Malone. You tell me. It's, again, not surprising that at the same time as black artists have surged in country, there's been a huge traditionalist backlash from people like Morgan Wallen and a lot of the old guard artists. The old guard artists is what I'm saying. And while certain strains of politics have always influenced country music, the world and the country music world, I would say, has never been more divided. But I think renewed interest in blending country with other genres, which is what's been happening again a good 10 years, as far as the current thread of that, is a sign that things will eventually come back together more than they are now and come more in the forefront in the pop world as well. Which gets us through that history, and let's talk about some conclusions. Country music has never been healthier or more widespread. It's one of the big ones. It's pop chart constant now. And it has been more than I ever remember because I was just not conscious of it. When I did that albums by decade and I saw how many country artists had #1 albums in every single year, I was blown away. And like any huge genre, you can't lump it all together. From the outside, people who don't know or like country might think of it as good old boy, retro, gray, conservative, rah-rah USA music. And a lot of it is. But right along with that is all other kinds of country and other kinds of voices. Country infused with hip-hop and R&B and alt country. There is room for everybody. Yeah, I wish some people would realize that more. In fact, Wikipedia lists over 50 subgenres of country. Now, I was going to read them all, and I'm like, nah. Especially doing this voice, I got to tell you, it's really straining my chords. I've mentioned at least a dozen. I think actually I've mentioned about 20 already. But here's some others I haven't mentioned. Americana, progressive country, roots rock, gothic country, which I think some of the fams was gothic country. Zydeco, one of my favorites. A country trap, which is blowing up and was not even on the Wikipedia list. And bro country, which also wasn't on that Wikipedia list. And I don't need to define bro country because I bet you could tell me right now what kind of music it is and who does it. And like with most genres, there came a point at which pop, country, and country rock, and I'm going to say this, you country fans out there, stopped innovating at all in pop country and country rock, and it started to copy what came 10 and 20 years before. And I'd say that was sometime after the mid-1980s when that first kind of neo-traditionalist movement started in the late 1980s. And there was that, offshoot of country-influenced pop and cowpunk and things happening. And then the traditionalists said, no, we want country to be this. it was a statement of saying for many decades, for pop country music to be country music, it had to be extremely regimented along kind of Nashville lines. I often feel like this is why I have trouble getting into country music. But I think this is also why others love it. It's familiar and just edgy enough because it echoes music that used to be edgy 10, 20 years ago. Now, to me, that's the lowest common denominator creation. It's pandering to people. But then again, if those people love it, then you're doing them a service. So what's my opinion matter here? Now, some of that pandering comes from adhering to what Nashville wants. So some of it is they want to be successful. They do that. I don't agree with that as an artist either, but you got to do what you got to do. Singing with a heavy twang, keeping your subjects populist, having certain instrumentation, and that's what makes it country. But who says, right? Only the musicians should say that. I can't tell you how many times I've heard a contemporary country song and felt like I was listening to alt rock from 20 years ago. Retrogressive music often appeals to retrogressive people. You can quote me out of context on that shit. I don't care. Listen, I know a lot of people who love oldies and are into old music who don't fall into this category. But I think it is a fact that retrogressive music tends to appeal more to retrogressive people. It's just true. Though, of course, not always. There's never a one-to-one relationship between music and politics, social issues, but it's enough that it grates on me as both a listener and a creator, and that's why I keep my distance from it. I'm doing myself a disservice. I realize that I shouldn't keep my distance. I should explore it more. There is still innovation and exploration in country music, but it's mostly been relegated to the alt genres and some of the rock, country rock, following the fracturing and dividing of the rest of the music culture and the culture at large. And the thing is, I think this relegating the innovation into non-pop country and keeping pop country so regimented makes both versions boring. In fact, I think a lot of the new style country artists who are infusing hip-hop, R&B, some of that's interesting, and some of it is kind of striving to be as boring as the rest of the stuff. It's less surprising. When all the effort to stretch is off the pop charts, it leaves the pop charts to stick strictly to formula, and both suffer. Alt kind of goes up its own ass and gets twee or super laid back and doesn't strive to be more accessible, and pop gets too accessible, too predictable, and too jingoistic. But again, the hope is that with the infusion of other genres into country, the overly simplistic and ritual elements will take a back seat, at least for some, and at least for a while. Cycles, people, cycles. So what kind of country do I like? That's what this whole thing was about. I got to throw back to the 70s and 80s for a lot of it, and some of those I named before, like Elvira, Oak Ridge Boys, Juice Newton, Eddie Rabbit, Dolly Parton, John Denver, some of Johnny Cash, some of Kenny Rogers. Some of the alt stuff from the 90s onward, I kind of liked Wilco. Fleet Foxes in, later on, and Bright Eyes, a little before that. Yeah, even a few of the pop hits from the 2000s onward, like Faith Hill, Breathe, and some of Taylor Swift's songs, especially since my kids liked Taylor Swift so much early on. Some of Miley's country music even. Things I kind of got into. I'm still trying to get more into the hip-hop, R&B tinged country. I would say Beyonce is a big one for me, the recent album. And Lil Nas X, I have actually performed Old Town Road and have enjoyed that song. And again, some of it veers into cliche tropes similar to some R&B, just like I heard it happening in 1999, which in both cases, there's such a range that I need to explore, again, more of new country, the way I have explored R&B, and find artists who are really pushing lyrics past drinking trucks and cheating and whatever. Now, I have dabbled in country and folk when it suited me or when the project called for it, and some of my non-country songs have country elements. Let's face facts. If you're doing rock and roll, then your songs have country elements, and you just have to face that. But in general, it's never been a huge touchstone for me, never been a favorite. Though, though that brings me to the featured song, and you'll get a kick out of this because I once co-produced and co-wrote a country EP And one of my songs, I think I had a couple, maybe 2 songs on there, and the other guy had 2 or 3, something like that. It was called Here's Your Hat. Here's your hat. What's your hurry? My dad, who had also fully wrote and produced his own country EP a few years before that, would often play Here's Your Hat, What's Your Hurry at his act, and people would line dance to it. So it's kind of funny that I wrote a song that people would do the thing. I wrote a song in a genre I didn't like to get people to do the thing I didn't like. And in the end, I kind of liked it all. That song has never been released, partly because it's never been more than a demo. It's not a good enough recording to be released out into the world, though I do plan to re-record it acoustically on my next album. More on that in a few months. So that's me coughing. Oh, that country cough. I wrote Here's Your Hat, What's Your Hurry to send up the tropes of country music. And I mentioned all the big ones, cheating and revenge and violence and pickup trucks and dogs, simple catchphrases. But I made it catchy, made it accessible, and I made it funny. The fact that the lyrics could fit into any country song of the last 60 years is a bit disturbing, but that's kind of why I did it. Granted, again, production is thin and meant to be only a demo, but I think you'll enjoy it in a minute or so when it plays, because you'll get the gist of the song. And I could imagine several traditionalist country artists covering this song. And if you're out there and you want a good song to cover country, call me up. Which brings me, by the way, bonus mention, bonus MxTRA video at patreon.com/music is not a genre. Speaking of traditionalist, it is on the longest running country act in history. I'll give you a hint. They've been around since the 1940s. Questions for you. What's your relationship with country music? Are you a huge fan? Do you like some things here and there? Or do you hate all of it? I'd love to know the answers to all this and more, because my objective here, as always, is music, conversation, and connection. Thank you for hanging with me and hanging with this frickin' voice, which has been killing me this entire episode. And I appreciate you, as always, and I'll talk to you next week.
You stole my woman, and now you're here, telling me you're short on cash. Could I buy you just one beer? I gotta tell you, man, I'm so surprised that you could even walk on in and look me in the eye. So I say, here's your hat, what's your hurry? I sure am sorry you have to go, but I cannot be responsible for what happens if you don't. You shot my puppy, and now you're back, saying you need a place to stay, and would I mind if you hit the sack? I gotta tell you, man, you got some nerve. If I had my dog again, I'd let him chase around dead man's curve. But I say, here's your hat, what's your hurry? It's such a shame you don't have the time. I guess I won't see your face in here no more, and you better hope you don't see mine. So you better just move on out before I lose my cool. Get on home, don't make yourself a bigger fool. You took everything I loved, I'm even out of love. I want you out of here so damn much, you can even take my pickup truck. such a shame you don't have the time. But I guess I won't see your face in here no more. And you better hope you don't see mine. No, no. 'Cause I'm just about through with being kind. Don't let the door hit you on the behind.